Okay, it is officially the noon hour. It is my great pleasure to introduce Sean McCormick. He is the founder of Executive Function Specialist, and he's pioneering cutting-edge practices to guide students with ADHD to overcome procrastination, disorganization, and school avoidance. His passion for empowering others led him to establish the Executive Function Coaching Academy, which offers training programs for aspiring executive function coaches. I'm very excited that you're here. I'm going to be taking notes, get some tips from you, and I will go ahead and pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this for months. And yeah, I think we should just jump into it because I know this is a lunch and learn and people got to get back to things. So let me pull up my slides here. Give me 1 second. Can I get a little thumbs up if people can see that? Thank you. Appreciate it. So we're going to talk about evidence-based strategies to support students with executive function challenges. So let's start off with what the research tells us. So in 2009, John Hattie published a book called Visible Learning. In this book, he detailed his analysis of about 800 meta-studies. So I know everybody here probably knows what a meta-study is or is very familiar with that concept. If anyone is new to it, a meta-study basically aggregates a bunch of different studies to find out what they can tell us from looking at a big clump of data. And this data encompassed about 50,000 individual studies and 250 million students globally. This was probably the largest study ever done on what helps students be successful to date. And what he was trying to identify was what factors most contribute to and detract from student achievement. And so every factor that he measured was given an effect size. And this effect size was used to evaluate what was more helpful in terms of supporting student achievement and what was less impactful. And there's actually a great aggregation of this data. If you Google visible learning study, you can actually kind of filter through this data by moving a kind of a tool to what has the biggest impact to the least impact. So I have a link to that I'll be sharing at the end of the slides or at the end of this presentation. And so basically he found that there was a hinge point, which was 0.4. And things above that were more impactful, things below were less impactful. And so he wanted to find out what works best in education, because this data could be used to really support students with what they need help with in the educational experience. So I want to show you what he found, because I actually discovered this after I transitioned from being a special education teacher in California to running my own business to help kids with executive function challenges. So I'm going to pull this up here and pop over to this. So there's a bunch of different visual models for this study, but this is one that I find to be helpful to look at. I think this was published in 2017 here. And so when you look at this data, you can see these are the things that had the highest impact. And this is that 0.4 I was referring to. That's that hinge point. So things above it were more impactful. So we look at here, this first one is teacher estimates of achievement. So what that means is basically when you look at the definition that they created for that, it's teachers' ability to accurately gauge what the student needs in terms of challenges. So in teaching, we often talked about what's the next appropriate scaffold, or what's the thing we need to put in front of the student that is appropriately challenging, but not so challenging that it's out of their zone of proximal development. So the educator, and I kind of think of teacher as just more than just classroom teacher. I think of it as like educator or support, could be a parent, could be a coach, tutor, but are they able to gauge where the student's at in their learning and provide an appropriate scaffold? Now, the next most impactful thing was collective teacher efficacy. And we're going to talk about this later, but collective teacher efficacy is basically, can a team that is supporting a student work together around a shared goal? So can they get on the same page about what they're working on with the student and then collectively support the student on that? Now, I point these out to you because 0.4, if you multiplied that by 4, that would get you to about these factors. And so the thinking behind this is that these really high impact strategies have the equivalency of 4 years of teaching in 1 year. Basically, that's how it's been broken down. And now, as you go down further, you'll see things that are less impactful. And this is really interesting. I often share this with parents and educators because as you go down, you start to see things that maybe people had thought was the biggest impactor, and actually research says it's not. So, for example, one thing that I often see surprising to people is parental involvement. Right, this one is above the zero point 0.4 hinge point, but it's still not as high as many of those other factors. So I tell parents, hey, it's not all your fault. If things don't go perfectly well, it's actually there's a lot of different factors that have a greater impact. But the reason I show this to you, and I'm going to ask you real quick, drop it in the chat box. What's something you think might have had the biggest negative impact? We're going to go down. So, you can just make a guess, but based on your clinical experience, what's something that you think might have the biggest negative impact on student achievement? I'm going to keep scrolling down. So now we're getting into the lower impactor, but if you keep going down, you actually get into things that have a negative impact. And I'm going to move my little zoom feature. So we see depression, boredom, deafness. But according to this research from Dr. John Hattie, ADHD has the greatest negative impact on student achievement globally, more than corporal punishment in the home, more than television not being liked in class. And that to me is extremely interesting because people often describe ADHD as executive dysfunction. I think it was actually at one point there was consideration around reclassifying ADHD as executive dysfunction. And so when I saw that after years of realizing that kids who can't organize themselves have the biggest struggles in schools, I realized that there's this really strong connection between executive dysfunction and basically life outcomes. So let's jump back over to the slides. Now, did that surprise anybody? Definitely, it surprised, but also validated my kind of experience when I saw that. So executive function skills, I believe, are the missing link in education. Now, some of you may be familiar with this lady, Dr. Adele Diamond. And Dr. Adele Diamond, according to a leading scientific journal, her impact ranked among the top 0.01% of all scientists across all scientific fields. And she did a study called Executive Functions. It was published in 2013, and it's among the 10 most downloaded papers in 2020 from all annual reviews across all disciplines. Now, there's a link to this I'm going to share with you a handout at the end of the presentation. But there's a link to this. So Dr. Adele Diamond found so she also did a meta study on different studies that looked at executive functioning. And she found that, for example, executive functions are more important for school readiness than IQ or entry-level reading or math. And executive functions predict both math and reading competence throughout the school years. So this is pretty, as a special education teacher, this is pretty mind-blowing to me because there's often so much focus on early interventions for reading and math, but I don't think I've ever heard of an early intervention that's utilized across school districts on executive function skills. But what we're learning is that's probably the most important thing we can do if we want to help kids learn how to access reading and math more effectively. But it goes beyond the classroom, right? Executive function skills impact marriages. A partner with poor executive function skills can be more difficult to get along with, less dependable, more likely to act on impulse. Public safety. Bad executive function skills lead to crime, reckless behavior, emotional outbursts, physical health, right? It's associated with obesity, overeating, substance abuse. Quality of life. People with better executive function skills enjoy a better quality of life. So this is why I describe executive function skills as the key to your future, because I believe if we can teach these skills to students, to young people, to young adults, even and to adults as well, that their life outcomes are going to be improved. But people often say like, well, what are they? There's so many things, like it's such a catch-all. So let's talk about what they are. So executive function skills or executive functions are a domain of cognitive processes, and they, according to different studies or different researches, they include attentional control, cognitive inhibition, inhibitory control, working memory, cognitive flexibility, described as flexible thinking, playing with information. And those processes, they work together to help us do things to reach our goals, right? I wrote here, select and monitor behaviors that facilitate the attainment of chosen goals. According to CHAD, the Children and Adult with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder organization, they account for short and long-term consequences of our actions and planning for those results. They help us make real-time evaluations of our actions and making adjustments as though the actions are not achieving the desired result. So when do we need these skills that help us reach our goals? Well, the way I like to break it down is that they help us handle situations that are outside the domain of our normal automatic psychological processing. So that might include planning or decision making. I put a little image here of like a wedding checklist because that's a very stressful life event for many people, and it forces their executive functions to work on a whole new level. Situations where responses are not well rehearsed. Maybe you're kind of tested or thrown into a situation where you have to think on your toes, as they say. It might also be dangerous or technically difficult situations that you weren't expecting. Has anyone faced a situation today already where your executive functions were challenged in a way that you weren't expecting? Maybe it's overcoming strong or habitual responses or resisting temptation. Now, oftentimes I'm asked, okay, so how do I explain this to my students, to my clients, to my patients? So I've come up with an acronym to help people understand what executive function skills are. It's called POSITIVE. And POSITIVE stands for planning, organization, self-awareness. The S, I often say self-awareness, self-advocacy, self-management if you're trying to remember different ones. I is for initiation, T is for time management, I is for initiation or inhibition, excuse me. V is for visualizing outcomes. Can you use your nonverbal working memory to kind of project what you want into the future? And E is, can you evaluate priorities towards that chosen goal? So at the end of the presentation, I do have an infographic that you can download if you want to utilize that to kind of have an easy way to explain that to your patients in the future or families that you're working with. So we've got through the first part. I don't think there's any questions in the chat, but if there are, feel free to drop them in now. But that's the first section, is what is the latest research telling us about executive function skills as well as executive dysfunction? So I wanted to share that with you. Of course, there's so much more, and I've aggregated a number of studies I found helpful in the handout that you'll get at the end, but I just wanted to start there. So in part 2 of this presentation, we're going to go into what's a framework you can use as a professional to implement some of the strategies we're going to talk about here. And then in part 3, we'll talk about what are some ways you can implement this. And I saw Sarah Elliott, you put in ADHD is so much more than executive dysfunction. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, emotional dysregulation is a big component. And I've often heard that that's, there's one, Dr. Russell Barkley, he talks about how self-regulation, he's a pretty reputable researcher on ADHD. I think he actually designed some of the assessments that are used often to evaluate executive dysfunction. And he said that self-regulation is the biggest piece of executive dysfunction that's often not, people talk about an attention deficit, but it's actually the inability to regulate our emotions because of the frustration that people experience with that attentional kind of variability. So just a little background on who I am. This is me, I think around 2017. I was running what's known as a counseling enriched classroom in Marin County at my old high school district, the Tamalpais Union High School District. And so this was a classroom of about 15 kids, many who were returning from residential treatment. And it was a special day class. So they were all in there and they had access to myself, special education teacher, and a counselor or a school psychologist. And so the goal was, how do we get kids grades 9 through 12 to graduate high school all in the same class at the same time? They also have to access all their different grade level coursework. And so that was my challenge. Like basically it was an educational Rubik's Cube. And so I was trying to figure that out. And it was pretty challenging, but I found that helping kids with identify their goal and work their way through things was the key. Now, I shared this picture with you because this is when my wife and I had our first daughter. And I shared this picture with my friends and they said, God, Sean, it looks like you gave birth, because I just looked so exhausted and tired and my wife looked so fresh and beautiful. And around this time was when I realized, oh, this is really hard to juggle working full time in a classroom and also trying to be, a very engaged parent. And so I realized that I needed something with a bit more flexibility than commuting for 3 hours a day, working in a classroom in a very challenging environment. So I decided to branch out and start helping kids with executive function challenges one-to-one. And I got this type of feedback when I started, and I wanted to share with you because I think it shows the impact that helping kids with executive function can have on their experience. So this parent said, by helping with his executive function skills, our son was able to focus more on school and stay on top of his homework. Since he was more focused on school, he was able to reap the rewards of better grades, and his video gaming decreased tremendously. Now, do any of you have parents or kids coming to you saying, "Oh, they're just watching YouTube, they're just playing video games all the time, they're just on their phone, we can't get them to do their work"? And the reason I ask that is because there's actually a way to help them, and it's not just by teaching teaching avoid YouTube strategies or taking things away. When kids know how to manage their life, they're going to set aside the things that are distracting. They're going to realize, like, wow, I have the power to manage myself. And I want to teach you some of those strategies that you
Maybe
can
next year we should add a second session with Miata.
on your for your clients. And I hear someone, I think you might need to mute yourself. So because of that, I started my business, Executive Function Specialist. And then I also started the Executive Function Coaching Academy, where I've trained over 300 school professionals, educators, doctors, psychologists who want to learn the core strategies for helping with executive function skills. And recently, in the past year, I also co-founded what's known as Upskill Specialist, which is an adult executive function coaching business. And we work primarily with self-determination clients in California to help adults with executive function challenges learn the core executive function skills that are going to help them transition effectively to adulthood. So let's dive into these strategies so you have a toolkit to utilize. So when we talk about executive function skills, I want to teach you an order of operations I've developed that is going to help you figure out where on the spectrum your student is and or your client is, and where you can start to tap into how to help them. So the first key is prioritizing a secure connection. And I'm sure many of you know this very well in your work with clients. The second key is establishing SMART goals, because if there's not a clear destination, oftentimes students or young people with executive dysfunction will feel overwhelmed and exhausted because they don't know where they're going. Then we talk about making everyone aware of the goal. And this goes back to that research I shared with you about collective teacher efficacy. When everyone's on the same page, the student can really make progress because they're being supported from different directions going towards the same objective. Then we go into divide and guide. This is where you want to help break things down into manageable chunks that can help them move forward. Accountability is the next step. You want to hold them accountable in ways that are supportive and scaffolded to ensure that they feel like they can make forward progress. And the last one is a way to lower the affective filter and help them engage. Show them you're proud. And this is something that a lot of parents struggle with. They kind of project their own sense of, oh, I was a Yale graduate or a Harvard graduate, so my kid should be here at this point. But oftentimes kids with ADHD, autism, traumatic brain injury, they can't progress at the same level that their parents would have at that age. And they need to see that even small increments of progress are meaningful and impactful. So that's the PEMDAS, the other side of PEMDAS that I've utilized to teach these skills to professionals and educators. So if there's any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat now. But now we are through part 2, which is a framework that you can utilize. But we're going to talk about how to implement this framework in part 3, and this is the meat of the presentation, is how can you take each of those strategies and then build them into your practice or your work. Does that sound good? So I like to teach through stories. So I want to introduce you to a young man named Edward. And Edward was a sophomore in public high school. A private assessment had found inattentive ADHD. He had qualified for a 504 plan, but not an IEP. And teachers had described him as a daydreamer and needs to put in more effort. So parents had tried a number of things. They tried tutoring, medication, therapy. But still, he kept getting this type of feedback. Hey, Edward, this was due 2 weeks ago. Edward, this needs more detail. So in my first meeting with Edward, I began like this. Hey, Edward, it's so great to see you. Is there anything pressing on your mind you would like to discuss before we work on school items? And he said, well, no, but thank you for asking. See, what kids with executive dysfunction are used to is, oh, you're lazy. You just don't care. You just need to try harder. Why can't you be more like your twin brother? Why can't you just turn it in? Do you even care? Right? And when they hear these things over and over, even if they're just subtle side comments or tones of voice or looks of disappointment, they start to get a closed mindset or a fixed mindset. But when you reverse the equation and you start to show them, hey, what's on your mind? Before we focus on this school stuff and making sure you're productive, what's on your mind? Because I want to know how you're doing. You show them that school is important, but they matter. And this is a very important small tweak you can make to ensure kids start to lower that affective filter and engage with what you're trying to offer them. Is anyone here familiar with the work of Dr. Stephen Krashen? So Dr. Stephen Krashen, I think he's one of the professor emeritus at UCLA, and he was he was a leader, a thought leader, I think in the late 80s and early 90s, when they were looking at how do we help this huge group of non-native English speakers who are coming to California learn how to transition into the school system, because there just wasn't enough non-native or non-English speaking teachers or teachers that spoke their native language to teach the content in both English and either Spanish or other languages. So they had to figure out a way to, how do we help non-native English speakers learn the content and receive their educational rights. And so what they found was that learners have what's known as an affective filter. And this is a barrier that they put up when they're overwhelmed, when they're stressed, when they're anxious in the classroom, and they cannot take in new information. And so this affective filter, it basically, you could say it funnels information, right? It prevents new things from entering if the kids are overwhelmed, if they don't feel supported or cared for. So it's a psychological barrier that goes up. So the way this might manifest is, oh, I feel different, I'm anxious, I'm lazy, I'm not going to graduate. And so these psychological barriers prevent students from acquiring new information. So this is a model of how this affective filter works. So while the teacher is trying to give input, they're trying to put ideas out there for the learner to take in. The students who are overwhelmed, scared, anxious, they're putting up this affective filter. And as you can imagine, a student who doesn't speak English, who maybe just moved to the United States and is expected to learn in a classroom where it's only English speaking, this can be pretty overwhelming. And so we had to figure out a way to lower that affective filter so they could access new information and start to play with that information using their executive functions and then learn. And so the question is, what teacher behaviors or what professional behaviors lower that affective filter? And the things that they've found are creating a safe, comfortable environment, right? Encouraging risk-taking, promoting interest, trying to place things within the student's interest. And that will lower the affective filter and allow the student to engage. But one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Stephen Krashen is he said, there's massive evidence that self-selected reading or reading what you want to read is responsible for most of our literacy development. Now, you might be saying, wait, I thought we were talking about executive functions. Why are you bringing up reading? Well, the reason I bring it up is because the key word here is self-selected. When students take executive authority over what they're learning about, and they feel like they have ownership or authority in the process, they start to learn. They start to lower that affective filter. So the question is, as a professional, as a parent, how do you allow your kids to take executive authority over what they're learning about? And that's what this PEMDAS method, which I'm teaching you, is going to hone in on. So I said to Edward, okay, for you to feel like our interaction today was a great use of your time, what would be different in your life by the end of this meeting? So instead of saying to him, hey, this is exactly what we're going to do. I have a plan laid out. I'm going to tell you what to do. You're going to do what I say, and we're going to be successful. I gave him authority. So he said to me, well, my history teacher told me I could raise my grade to a B if I just finished this essay, but I just can't figure out how to start it. Okay, good to know. What if we make an outline? So 30 minutes later, Edward had made his outline. He had filled in the blanks with my scaffolds or my estimates of achievement. And so when he finished it, I said, okay, Edward, what if we upload this to Google Classroom and we'll leave a note to your teacher that says, I've completed a draft. Could you please review and provide me with any suggestions on what I need to do to earn an A? Because I asked him, what grade do you want to earn on this? And he said, well, I'd love an A. Okay, great. So in that process, I didn't tell Edward what to do. I held the space. I showed him that I valued him by asking him what was on his mind before we worked on anything school related. And then I gave him authority over the outcomes of the session by asking him, what would be the most meaningful thing we could do in this meeting for you to feel value from this interaction? So I prioritized a secure connection. Now, the research basis for this, you may be familiar with the collected works of John Bowlby. And there's a study, it was called Psychologist Perception of the Importance of Common Factors in Psychotherapy for Successful Treatment Outcomes. Now, I am not a therapist, but I am an educational therapist, and this is a branch of education that really focuses on the therapeutic intervention in education. And he found that, or they found in the study that participants were expert psychologists with an average of 23 years of experience providing psychotherapy. And on average, the most important common factor was the therapeutic alliance. So the reason I share that is that I want you to remember that before anything else, before you get down to the nitty-gritty kind of detail work, that connection is so key. And this is what I teach to parents, to educators, to professionals, is that always go back to prioritizing that connection if you're feeling lost in the process. So now I want to turn it to you, and I want you to drop in the chat box so people can learn from each other, because that's so important, is that connection that you're learning from each other in this organization, is how do you prioritize a secure connection with patients? So drop in one of your favorite strategies or a couple favorite strategies if you'd like. This is an opportunity for you all to learn from each other. And please do share that in the chat box. And while you're doing that, I'm going to continue onward. We're going to talk about, so now Edward is feeling safe. And it was time to dive a little bit deeper in the process. And I said, hey, Edward, okay, can you show me what your current grades are? So this was the baseline for Edward. He had a D in English, a D in math, a C in science, a D in humanity, a B in modern language. Not ideal. And I said, okay, what grades do you want to see on your report card at the end of this semester? Right? I'm not telling him you need to earn all A's or you need B's and A's or I'm going to be disappointed, which is sometimes the tone that students hear from others. He said, well, I'd love to have A's and B's if possible. And then I said, how would you feel to see your report card with all A's and B's? Now, this is a really important question. How would you feel? And this taps into that nonverbal working memory. And many of you have probably seen studies about how when we visualize things, we're more likely to achieve those things, or that I think there was a study, I'm not sure if I included it in this presentation, but there was a study done at a university where they took two groups, and one group visualized lifting weights and one group actually just lifted the weights without visualization. And the group that visualized lifting weights were also able to gain muscle mass just from the visualization portion, I believe. So that ability to place yourself in the feeling or project yourself into the future is huge. And he said, I'd feel incredible if I had all A's and B's. And then I said, will you write those things down? Now, this is a study which I'm not completely comfortable saying. I have researched this, and there's a link on Dominican University for it, but then it's like a broken link. So I think that the research exists, but I haven't found it. But I want to share it with you just in case someone knows Dr. Gail Matthews, since we're here in the Bay Area. But in this study that is often cited across in articles, they found that the participants who wrote down their goals were 42% more likely to achieve them. So the research basis for this is not as strong, but in my own personal experience, I have found that writing things down definitely helps me. And if anyone has research that you've identified in this area, I do think there needs to be more documented on this, because writing things down has a huge impact in my experience coaching students as well as teaching. So what I had Edward do was write down all his goals that he had stated: earn an A in geometry, earn a B in chemistry, in Google Tasks. The reason I had him do Google Tasks is because I think it's over 60% of students in the United States have access through their school system to the Google suite, Google Tasks, Gmail, but most kids are never taught how to use these things, and they're completely confused. They don't know how to use Google Calendar. They don't know how to use the email system. So a big part of the work often is just giving them literacy around how to use these technical skills so that they can start to leverage them and externalize their brain. And so if you're wondering how to use that, because sometimes I talk about small tweaks have big peaks. Sometimes just teaching them how to use these little note tools in Gmail, on Google Tasks, has a huge impact. Like, oh my God, I had no idea that was there. And now I don't have to store everything in my brain, and I can actually write things down on my computer or my tablet while I'm doing my homework. And so in the handout, there's also going to be a place where you can see a video on how to utilize those tools. I have a little course, a free course, and YouTube videos on how to use those tools to get kids more acquainted with the tools that are at their disposal. And that's the second step in this PEMDAS methodology, which is establish SMART goals. A SMART goal is often confusing to people. They're like, I don't know how to make it specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, timely. But really, it's an easy way to write one is earn a B in your class by the end of the semester. That's specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, time-orientated. It's going to happen by the end of the semester or not. And so that's an easy way for kids to utilize the SMART methodology so that they can start to set things that they can measure whether or not they did it or their progress towards it. Now I'm going to pop out, open the chat just to see what people are saying about their favorite strategies for engaging their students. So Sarah shared distraction-free attention. Yeah, absolutely. There's nothing more impactful than that direct attention. Anne shared give attention, presence, interest, and authenticity. Yeah, I like irreverence, Melissa. Thank you for sharing that. Genuineness and reverence. So thank you everybody for sharing those. Really powerful. And I encourage people to go back and check those out and learn from your colleagues here. Okay, so just as far as what research basis there is on SMART goals. Now, I know research is typically meant to be within the last 10 years, but if you do want to look at some of these, I guess you could say, studies that have been around, there have been some studies on the impact of SMART goals. So I've included those in the research basis for you to look at. Now, Katina, I also saw you have a comment about taking the focus away from grades and back on their efforts. So yes, of course. And people say, well, shouldn't we not focus on grades? And what I tell students is, hey, what do you want to do, right? I want to give students a clear measuring stick so that they can self-evaluate. Because if you go back to that study that I shared with you on the most impactful things on student achievement, the third one from the top was self-reported grades. So what I want to do is just give students a way to self-evaluate and start to measure their own progress. And I tell kids, look, you choose. It doesn't matter to me what grade you get. I want you to just feel like you're engaged with the process, because of course, grades are a tiny reflection of the actual character and experience of the student. There's so much more. I agree with that. So I said to Edward, okay, now that you know what grades you want to earn, can you show me what assignments are missing and what will be due soon? Because what happens with a lot of kids is they don't even know how to see these things, and their parents may not either. So they're just in this kind of, I guess you could say, Bermuda Triangle or kind of circular experience where they don't even know how to do what they're expected to do. And because they're working with a teacher who might have 30 students in every class or 20 plus students, no one's actually teaching these skills. And so what I have students do is say, show me how you know what's due and what's upcoming, right? And so they'll say, well, on Canvas, I have this agenda. On Google Classroom, I have to manage these assignments. Then there's this one teacher who doesn't use either of those, so I have to check their website. And I said, wow, that's a lot to track. Now, have any of you ever worked with a kid who has to tap into 2, 3 portals just to figure out what's due each day or what they're expected to do? So what I told Edward is, hey, why don't we make a list with each assignment and its point value and tasks? Are you up for that? Now, what I just did there and what I've been doing throughout this presentation, and this is a very impactful tool that I want to give you for your toolkit if you're not already using it. It's what's known as the trial yes. And the trial yes is basically getting a small buy-in from someone every step of the way, rather than getting to the end of your idea and saying, are you going to do this, right? So let's look at how this can work. So for parents, educators, professionals, you could say something like, instead of saying something like, do you have any homework? You could say something like, hey, did you want to earn some screen time? Yes. Okay. Can we look at your assignments to see what needs to get done before you earn that screen time? or to earn that screen time. So what happens here is once they've bought into that first initial question, that is what I recommend doing. It's like the foot in the door, something very small. Then you move on to a more impactful, or I guess you could say bigger ask. So some examples of trial closes are, right? Are you ready to get started? Are we on the same page? Does that make sense to everyone? And this comes from a very famous study by Friedman and Fraser, which was compliance without pressure, the foot in the door technique. And what Friedman and Fraser found was that individuals who agreed to comply with a small request evinced a greater willingness to comply with a subsequent larger request than people who only were asked to comply with the larger request. And the reason for this is people don't like to contradict themselves. So if they've said yes to something that's in line with the second request, they want to stay aligned with their initial belief or their initial commitment. So this is a great way to help people incrementally buy into a process. So then I said to Edward, okay, so you want to make sure you get credit for everything you turn in, right? Because one of the biggest, most frustrating experiences for students is when they do what you say as a parent, educator, or professional, and then they go to their teacher and turn it in, and the teacher says, you can't turn this in. This is too late. Sorry, no credit. And they've spent 4 or 5 hours working on some essay or something, and they're basically rejected. So that's a very painful experience. Some people align that to educational trauma, where they feel very rejected, and then they have difficulty buying into what you're trying to help them with later on. So I said to Edward, okay, well, let's make sure to email your teacher to confirm you can still earn credit. Does that work for you? Yeah, I can do that. Now, if any of you have sat with a student with a learning disability in the past, you may have heard some of these responses when you've asked them, hey, why don't we clarify this with your teacher? Oh, I don't want to bother them. Oh, they've got too many other students. I'll just talk to them in class. Does that sound familiar to everyone? You can drop a yes in the chat if you've heard something like that before when you're trying to support someone to access their education. So I've come up with a little method called ping. And I was trying to think of what's the best way to teach people how to help students move forward with engagement. And especially students with autism, sometimes the open-ended nature of communication can be overwhelming. But if it's broken down into a very structured process, they will start to engage in a way that is surprising to many people. And of course, it's a spectrum. It's not the same for all students, but this is what I've seen in my work as a special educator. So PING stands for pleasant introduction, inform and inquire, negotiate the need, and end with gratitude. So let's look at how this might work in practice. And I've also heard other people say, oh, I can actually use this to teach my colleagues or my direct reports how to effectively communicate. Because, you know, the majority of the skills I talk about are never taught in school. I call it the hidden class. They're just, there's so much focus on content, but not actually the how of education and the soft skills. So let's look at this. The P stands for that pleasant introduction. Hi, teacher, hope you're doing well. It can be as simple as that. Because most kids they'll put no subject line, and then they'll just put, can I turn this in, or something. And teachers typically don't respond effectively to that. So then they go into the inform, inquire part. Hey, I noticed my grade in your class is currently a D or a C. My goal is to earn a whatever they want, a B, an A. My plan is to complete the following assignments in this order. Assignment you will complete first, assignment you complete second. And remember, they have all these assignments. They know the point value of them because they've put them in that task list. Or that I have a student digital planner, which I share with students, which you'll have access to at the end of this. So they are able to easily access this information without having to search through their portals because they've been building this plan. And notice in this method, they're showing self-awareness. They're showing an executive goal setting process. Now, of course, it's not all about the grades, but when kids know what they're working on, when they're able to follow the system and engage in a way that actually works for them, their confidence starts to bloom because like, hey, I can do this stuff. I can be successful in the social system, right? In this expected framework. And so then you go into inquire curiosity. Is there anything else you suggest I do to work toward my goal of earning desired grade in your class? Right? So now they're inquiring. They're not demanding, they're inquiring. And this is a powerful tool that students don't realize they can utilize. Like they don't have to say, I need this. They can just say, can you guide me? So now they're giving the teacher authority to support them. And this is where they start to learn negotiation. And I tell my students this, I tell people this, everything is negotiable. Because at the end of the day, it's the teachers or the administrators putting the grades in, right? So when you realize that things are not fixed in stone and that you can negotiate your way to a solution, this is extremely powerful for students who kind of had a fixed mindset around grades and school and teachers before this. And so they might say something like this: will I be able to earn full credit if I complete these and submit them to you by, and they choose the date. Now they're making an executive decision here, they're negotiating. And what I always tell students is, hey, put in a more extended date, right? Don't say tomorrow. Give yourself time, because often kids with executive function challenges have struggles with making time estimates. So I really want to encourage them to give themselves more wiggle room. And then finally, gratitude, because you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right? So thank you for your guidance. Most kids don't put anything like this. They have, what often happens is, because of the disappointment, they expect or they have unrealistic expectations. So here they're just humbly nodding that, like, hey, I appreciate you helping me, right? And this is a powerful soft skill to teach to students. Now, at the end of this presentation, I have a whole series of templates which I've developed over years of working with students. So this is just the outline for it, but all these templates are available to students. They're fill in the blank templates so they can put in their grades, they can put in their assignments. And these are really helpful for students as a starting place, because oftentimes it takes a lot of time for them to actually craft these ideas out. And so it's better that they can have it and modify or choose. And that takes away some of the overwhelm and exhaustion that might occur if you just had to have the students sit there and write out the whole email. It might take the whole meeting or interaction with them. So rather, it's better to potentially be able to provide some of these things and let them choose and modify it for their own purposes. So the student might say, oh my God, that took so long. How am I going to do this for all my teachers, all my classes? Because I have D's and F's across the board. Well, as I said, you can use these templates, but attached to this presentation, I've also included a short how-to video I made on how students can actually turn in what's known as templates on Gmail. This is also available on the Microsoft email system. And you can turn on these templates so you can save that email so they don't have to rewrite these things over and over, which can become really exhausting for students with special needs. And then they can just plop that template in and modify it per teacher, change the teacher's name. So that's in the handout you'll get at the end of the presentation. So now, of course, Edward was a little nervous to send this email, but within 5 minutes of sending that proposed plan, the teacher responded. And what do you think they said? Edward, I love to see you taking ownership of your work. Yes, you can absolutely turn in those items to get credit. If you need any help with it, come to my office hours on Thursday at 3 p.m. So what I've found in my work is that when students start to reach out and ask for help, instead of getting shut down or treated meanly, which is what they're often afraid of, oftentimes there's so many helpers out there. I tell this to my own children. I say, look for the helpers. That was something I think Mr. Rogers said, but look for the helpers out there, because so many educators, they didn't get into this work for a big paycheck. They got in because they want to help students. And when you ask for help, you allow a teacher to do their job. It's a way to build a relationship. And so that's how you make everyone aware of the goals. You start putting your vision out there so that other people can support you, because people have lots of experience and skills that oftentimes students are not aware of, and they don't realize how much the people around them can help them. Now, if you're wondering, like, is it actually essential to teach these skills? Well, there's actually some recent research. This one was called Too Anxious to Talk: Social Anxiety, Academic Communication, and Students' Experiences in Higher Education. And they found that studying over 1,000 students, among the results, social anxiety was negatively related to communication with instructors and student experiences. And educators should consider the needs and struggles of these students when designing their courses to create inclusive learning environments. And so what I want you to take away from this is that it's so important to explicitly teach these communication skills, which as adults, sometimes we forget that the basic things that we know how to do, that we've learned how to do, are very foreign and unfamiliar to our students. A lot of kids don't know how to craft a proper email or ask for help. And email, I always stress the importance of email, because if you're working directly with a student, you may not be able to sit there with them and coach them on how to interact with the teacher, but you can sit there with them and show them how to write an email and give them the courage and confidence to send it. That's something you can do. It's in your zone of control, or your locus of control. So do consider using that or suggesting that to your clients. Now, thinking of your patients, what school-related thing do you find that they avoid most? Please drop it in the chat box. Really helps me to know. And before we jump into the next section, I just want to see what some people are saying. Yeah, I don't know what to write or say. Let's see here. I found templates, best shared. I found templates to be incredibly useful for my own professional emails as well. Yes, as a professional, I actually use a tool called Superhuman. You can create a lot of templates in there. It's an email system that kind of sits on top of Gmail, and they have what's known as snippets, and that has been incredibly helpful. I use these types of templates constantly in my work. Asking for help. Anna shared, my student struggles with how to not to read online, or with how not to read online when not connecting. Yeah, right. Or maybe they're jumping on Reddit, or they're just like reading articles rather than engaging in the class. Essays and papers, Bridget shared. Jennifer shared using accommodations, even if they have them. Yeah, a lot of kids don't even know what their accommodations are. So one of the first things that I have students do when we start working together is look at their 504, their IEP. We go through their accommodations, and then they email the teacher, letting them know, hey, here's the most useful accommodation for me, and here's how I imagine we can use it. So let's keep going, because we've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure we leave some time for additional questions. So I said, okay, Edward, now we know you're going to get credit. Your teacher responded, but you still have to get the work done, right? So do you want to make a plan? Now, a student will, if they don't say it, they're probably feeling this, but they'll say, how do I know what to start with when everything feels overwhelming, right? Like I have 6 classes. I've often thought about the idea that, we're adults, right? We have one job, typically, maybe one job in our family, but kids have 6 classes almost. These are kids with kind of lower developed executive function skills. They're expected to manage 6 classes, potentially play sports, be home, be productive and helpful at home. That is a huge cognitive load for kids. And so one of the easiest ways to start with kids is say, hey, I know everything feels overwhelming, but what class has the lowest grade? Okay, they're like, okay, I have an F in science. Okay, now what assignment, because you wrote all these out with their point values, has the greatest point value in that class with the F? So that's one way to teach prioritization, is to say, look, I know some things may be weighted. We're going to check with your teacher about that after, but what class has the lowest grade and what assignment has the biggest point value? And that's just one black and white method to start helping them learn how to prioritize. So once they identify that, then you might say something like, how long would you be willing to work on that assignment for? Right? Now they're continuing to take ownership of their engagement on this thing that they're avoiding. So I've had kids say, I can do it for 2 minutes. Okay, can you set a timer for 2 minutes? Now, 99% of the time, what I've found is that they'll do 2 minutes of the assignment, and then I'll be like, do you want to keep going? And they'll say yes, because the biggest hurdle is the initiation of the task. And when they start it, they start to feel a sense of relief, of catharsis, like, oh my God, I've been avoiding this for weeks. My parents have been yelling at me, stressing on me. I've been getting emails from my teacher, and I've not been able to start it. And now I feel good just moving forward on this. So that's a powerful strategy to help them engage. And then you could say something like, okay, what do you think the next step is? Kids often know what they need to do. They just need someone prompting them effectively through motivational interviewing or inquiry-based questioning. And that's how you divide and guide. You just keep scaffolding it. That's that teacher estimates of achievement part that has potentially 4 years of impact within 1 year of teaching. Divide and guide. Now, there's a great research basis for motivational interviewing. One that I found that I want to share with you is motivational interviewing had a significant and clinically relevant effect in approximately 3 out of 4 studies, with an equal effect on physiological 72% and psychological 75% diseases. This is especially, so if you want to check that study out, I've linked it in the end in the research, so you can look at that. And this study continues to say psychologists and physicians obtained an effect in approximately 80% of the studies when using motivational interviewing in brief encounters of 15 minutes. 64% of the studies showed an effect. More than one encounter with the patient ensures the effectiveness of motivational interviewing. So that's why I always talk about too, like people ask, oh, how long should I be working with a coach for? Or how long should I do this? Well, I recommend meeting once a week throughout the entirety of one semester to really get really engage with the process and go through it for school. So I said, Edward, okay, for you to reach your goals, you'll need to work between meetings. Are you open to that? And so people often say, okay, well, they're doing something when they meet with me, but then they do nothing. What help? What do I do? So this is called the one thing strategy. And what you do here is instead of giving them a whole list of things to do between meetings, you say, hey, what's the one thing you want to do before our next interaction in a week? Or if you're meeting with them less frequently, whatever time frame it is. Now, why just one thing? Well, if they do that one thing, that's an opportunity for them to move on to the next thing, right? But you shouldn't start with two things when they haven't even displayed the ability to do one thing independently. Now, you don't want to just say by, what's the one thing? Then you say by when? Okay, I want to do it by Thursday at 7 p.m. Okay, how can you show me you have completed that one thing? Now, this may be beyond the bounds of how you typically work with students. I've found that sometimes using something like email or text messaging can be really helpful for a kid who's avoidant of things. So I'll say something like, can you text me a picture to prove you've completed that one thing that you said you're going to do? Now, when they have this level of accountability, and then I'm willing to check in with them after that meeting, there's a quote in teaching. They say, kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And this is your way of moving beyond the norm and taking it to another level of care and engagement that can often be life-changing for students. And so then I say, okay, you're gonna have to actually set an alarm. You said you're gonna send me a picture of this by 7 p.m. on Thursday. I want you to set an alarm because this is the barrier. They may say they want to do it, but because of working memory challenges, they'll forget when they walk out of the room or when they leave the Zoom. So they actually have them set an alarm on their phone to send proof when they've completed it. And I set an alarm on my phone to check in 30 minutes after that if they haven't done it. Now, people might say, okay, isn't there more to executive function skills than just managing homework? Of course, there's so much more. But one of my favorite poets, I have one of my teachers after high school. He gave me is Gary Snyder, a famous poet who documented life in Marin in the Bay Area. He said, you have to learn to follow a path before you can carve a new path. And so when we teach kids how to manage school effectively in a way that they can relate to, then they start to see that anything is possible. But you have to trust a process and work within a framework. When I joined Teach for America in 2015 or 2014, they asked me to write my favorite quote on the back of a clipboard that they gave to me for the summer program. And I wrote, strength is born in constraint and dies in freedom. It's a quote by Leonardo da Vinci. And I believe that sometimes you have to set up a system and a structure. And once you find success within that system, then you can move on to other things that are meaningful or setting your own goals. But sometimes you have to create that framework in that space for them to find success in the thing that they're expected to do. So yes, of course, it's more grades, homework. They're not the keys to life. In fact, they probably don't even matter out of school. But when we show students they can be successful in these frameworks, it's a huge confidence booster. And so what Edward started to do was things like this. Hey, teacher, I just emailed you the following assignments. Could you please let me know if there's anything else I can do to earn an A on these assignments? Right? So now he's checking in. And so what we did each meeting was we worked on following this process: complete, submit, request feedback, respond appropriately to your teachers, things that had just been missing from his life because no one knew how to teach it to him. And what happened was Edward's grades and missing assignments started to improve, but his confidence returned. He went from dejected, closed mindset to engaged in imagining possibilities in his life. Now, you might be wondering, okay, Sean, that's great that it worked for Edward, but what about kids who aren't engaged or are disconnected? So I want to introduce you to Orion, and we'll quickly go through this experience. And I know we only have about 6 minutes. I'll go through this real quick, and then we'll leave time for 1 or 2 questions. And people can also follow up with me via email if you'd like to chat more. But Ryan said, okay, I'm all done with my homework, even when his parents and educators knew there was missing assignments. They might ask, how are you going to raise that low grade? And, or Ryan would say something like, oh, that's not possible. The teacher doesn't like me. Has anyone heard something like this from students in the past? Or maybe they agree to do things when you talk to them in your meetings, but then they rarely follow through. Now, you might have parents you've worked with who said they've tried pulling, they've tried begging, they've tried bribing with YouTube or video games, but still they feel stuck. Does this resonate with anyone who's worked with students with executive function challenges? So the final process that I want to talk to you about, and this is the most important tool I have in my toolkit, is the family team meeting. And this is a process I learned by working with wraparound agencies in my special education classroom. And I want to give you a framework that you can facilitate or teach to others or apply. I think it is incredibly powerful, and I've seen massive change happen from this. The family team meeting is a structured decision-making meeting led by a trained facilitator that guides a student support team to use their collective wisdom and skills to support a student in reaching an agreed upon goal. So whatever it is you all agree on as a team, you're going to hold a family team meeting month by month to work on that big vision. And this is how you increase collective efficacy, which is defined by Hattie as a team's shared belief that through collective action, they can positively influence student outcomes, including those who are disengaged or disadvantaged. And this, on those factors I shared with you that have the biggest impact on student achievement, is number 2, collective teacher efficacy with 1.57 effect size. Now I'm going to walk you through the agenda and also give you a handout that you can use to run these types of meetings for yourself. So the family team meeting is very simple. You don't have to really plan that much for it. You just have to hold the space. What's going well? What needs to change? Who does what by when? Now, a couple of tips for you for what's going well. Everyone shares out. You speak from the heart. And if you're facilitating, you curb that critical feedback and say, hey, we're going to have time for constructive feedback. But right now, we're just focusing on what's going well, because that's what lowers the effective filter for the student. So maybe it's something like, hey, I'm just proud you've been going to your therapy sessions, or I'm proud you took out the garbage last week. When you go into the what needs to change, you ask the student first, what do you want to see by our next family team meeting in 1 month? If a parent says something like, well, I want them to have straight A's across the board, you turn to the student and you say, does that feel realistic to you? And then you start to facilitate an agreement that's realistic for both the student and the parents or the caregivers. Now, the whole way through, someone should be documenting these agreements, this plan, because this is going to be the point of truth for this process. And in the slides at the end of this presentation, you'll have access to this template. Now I'm going to skip through this, but just what I want you to know here is do be specific in this process. Don't say, why can't you just do better? Things like, hey, okay, we've all agreed that, turning in your history project by the end of the month is key. What support do you need from us to fulfill that? Now, I'm going to skip through here because I've included the slides for anyone who wants to go back and really dive into how to use this process. But this is an example of how this type of meeting could look for a student in a family. What I want to end with is that accountability piece. When things aren't working as expected, hold everybody accountable by holding that family team meeting on a consistent basis. And so what happens when you engage in this type of process is you have students responding with things like this. Oh my God, I'm finally turning in my assignments. Or maybe they say things like, I've never finished a project so early. I've seen these things over and over. And so what happens is the grades start to improve, which is nice, but more importantly, their self-esteem returns and they start to feel capable of achieving things. And so I'm going to pause there because that is the end, is show them you're proud. And so these are the tools that I want to give to you for your toolkit so that you can start to think about ways that you can help your students, clients with executive function skills. And so hopefully now you feel more prepared to have an updated toolkit for supporting EF difficulties. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in the chat box the handout that I was talking about that you can utilize to look at the slides. You can follow up with me about that if you'd like, if you have any questions about that. So thanks so much, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time to engage in this and watch this. And if there's time for one question, I'm happy to answer it.
This was fantastic, Sean. I so appreciate your energy and your humility and how fun you make the material. So thank you. I can see why you're such a marvelous educator. We have one question, and I just see lots of gratitude in the chat.
Thank you.
We learned a lot. Does a brave colleague want to unmute themselves and ask a question? I don't see any questions in the chat that I can monitor right away.
And I know that was a lot, but I feel compelled to deliver those ideas. So I squeezed in a lot. So I apologize if anyone feels overwhelmed. Something I recommend is think about one thing you can take away from this. What's one thing one small tweak And I see Christine has her hand up, so I'd be happy to answer your question, Christine. Or
Hi, Sean. Thanks for that talk. That was really, really great. I work with lots and lots of families whose kids have ADHD and they're, the kids themselves. And the biggest, a lot of them are getting this kind of coaching. What parents will say, though, a lot of the time is that essentially the kids are still just doing the work only with that coach. They're not really learning skills. And that's really what the parents want, are skills that they can carry forward when they go off to college. So I know you just, it looks like the family meeting would be a good framework for that, but what are some other things to tell parents? Because they often still feel like, well, the nagging that they did or the structure they did is then just being done by you or someone like you, and they still just don't have those skills that they really need to be independent. So that's the main thing, is the independence. So
yeah,
any thoughts on that?
yeah, it's a great question, and it's probably the biggest issue. And what I'll tell you is this, is that what parents sometimes do is they get frustrated that their kid needs help and they withhold support. And because of that, they think, oh, I'm facilitating independence by withholding support. But what they actually do is they foster greater dependence on coaches or parental interventions. So the key is that teacher estimates of achievement, which is the right amount of support, where you're I call it approximating, right? It's where you're giving just enough of a kind of like cue or support to where they're doing something independently, and then you're fading support. And that's something that's hard to explain in terms of like, well, how do we make sure that's done across every situation? But that's what we know helps learners move forward, is that teacher estimates of achievement, according to the research. So what you really want to do is, I have an article on my website, efspecialist.com. It's a guide to finding the right EF coach. And I would suggest asking those questions when you're looking for a coach, because you do want someone who's going to fade their support and also have a way to, I always say it's not about the coach, it's about the team approach, that collective teacher efficacy, or that collective, like you mentioned, the family team meeting. So a good coach should really be working their way out of a job, a good teacher, a good educator. But if we withhold support from the beginning, we say, well, other kids your age are doing this, so you should just be able to do it. First off, never should on someone. And second off, you do have to give some level of support. And is there anyone in this room who didn't have an amazing teacher, parent, educator who gave them that support and helped them move forward when they felt stuck, overwhelmed? I'm sure everyone can think of someone immediately in your mind who was there for you when you felt like, I can't move forward to get my dissertation done, or I can't get this. So I would say, don't withhold, but do your due diligence to find someone who understands that balance and is able to slowly fade out, and also provide opportunities to practice things independently, whether it's over summer or maybe you space out meetings and phase out. So does that help at all?
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sean. That's unfortunately all the time that we have this afternoon. It was such a pleasure having you here, and you'll be sharing your slides, so that'll be a great resource for folks. So much appreciated. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon and take good care, Sean.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.